And this idea that you can say to a child after having met with a parent and having the parent's partnership with you, your mommy, your daddy told me that they fight a lot and they hit each other, or that your daddy hit your mommy and then he left. And now you can't sleep and you are so mad at your mommy and you miss your daddy and you hit the dog and you hit your brother. That being real, being authentic, calling it the way it is, with a 2-year-old, a 3-year-old, a 4-year-old, a 5-year-old, I believe can be incredibly relieving.
Hello and welcome to this live legacy interview with Professor Alicia Lieberman, whose work with babies and children is credited with transforming the lives of families around the world. Now more than ever, we know that mental ill health is preventable if the right care is given early on in life. In this series of interviews, we're profiling the work of leading lights in child mental health, helping those of us working or caring for children to be as informed as we can by the wisest minds to give them the best start. For those of us working therapeutically with families, Alicia Lieberman is an inspiration. Her research and trainings have shaped our understanding of the relationship between children and their parents and the impact this has had on trauma. Whilst we've been preparing for this interview, many colleagues have told us that the field of child mental health would not be the same without Alicia. Alicia, welcome and thank you for agreeing to share your knowledge and wisdom with us in this interview and honouring your work.
Jane, thank you so much for this lovely introduction. I'm honoured and moved to be here to see this wonderful audience and to be here also with Salam and with my dear friend Arietta.
Well, it's our privilege to have you. Thanks, Alicia. So to introduce myself and my co-presenter, Salam Solomon, I'm Jane O'Rourke, a child and family psychotherapist. I run the counselling service in a state primary school here in London, and I'm also the founder of MINDinMIND. And it's my great pleasure to be sharing this interviewing today with my colleague, Salam Solomon. Salam is Director of the Centre for Prevention and Early Trauma Treatment at Child First. She's also a board member of the American Psychological Association's Division 39, Section 2. Thanks for co-chairing the discussion with me today, Salam. I know Alicia has had a big impact on your work.
Thanks, Jane. Yes, I and all my colleagues at Child First have been big fans of Alicia and her work for many years. She has dramatically changed the way I understand, do, and supervise work with families, with babies and young children. And I'm so honored that she accepted our invitation for this interview, and I'm looking forward to 2 magical hours. I shared with Alicia my dream about this interview series almost 2 years ago, and I'm so glad that the day has finally arrived to have her join us.
It's great to be here.
Thanks, Salam. So we ask our legacy interviewees to invite some special guests with us, with whom they can share the contribution their work has made to the field of child mental health. Today, we've got 2 outstanding clinicians in their field. Arietta Slade is Professor of Clinical Child Psychology at Yale University. She's internationally recognised for her work with high-risk mothers and for her research on reflective parenting and attachment difficulties. For many years, Arietta, you've collaborated with Alicia, haven't you?
I would say collaborate isn't quite the right word. We've written a few chapters together, but we've mostly been really good colleagues and really good friends. And we sort of admire each other's work. We read each other's work. We are moved by each other's work. And today I'm going to talk about how much her work has changed and moved me.
I'm looking forward to that. Also joining us later is Marquita Mays, a clinician and international expert on race and trauma experienced by Black families. And we're looking forward to hearing about her Embrace programme and how she's adapted her training with Alicia to working with Black families. But first, our live legacy interviewee, Professor Alicia Lieberman. Alicia, you're perhaps most known for being the senior developer of child-parent psychotherapy, a widely used evidence-based treatment for traumatized children and their families. Your work has been incredibly wide-ranging, but an ongoing focus has been how to help traumatized families with attachment difficulties and researching the effectiveness of child trauma psychotherapy. Early interventions, such as working with pregnant women experiencing domestic violence, has been an important focus for you too as well, as has your attention to cultural issues that impact on how children develop and are parented. You're the Irving B. Harris Endowed Chair in Infant Mental Health and Professor in the Department of Psychiatry at the University of California in San Francisco. You're also the Director of the Child Trauma Research Program at San Francisco's General Hospital. You've received many accolades for your work. As their former president, the organization 0 to 3 honored you with a Lifetime Achievement Award. And you've also been honored by the Sims-Mans Institute and the World Association of Infant Mental Health. Just coming to your legacies, Alicia, I think one of your most significant aspects of your work has been the therapeutic intervention known as child-parent psychotherapy. How does this model differ from other sorts of child-parent therapies?
Thank you for your introduction, Jane. And I think that we could say that what distinguishes child-parent psychotherapy from other models is the very focused attention to how traumatic events in the here and now affect the child. We come from a very honored tradition of privileging the intergenerational transmission of trauma and of pathogenic forms of relating through unresolved conflicts in the parent's psyche, going back to their childhood, what Selma Freiberg brilliantly called ghosts in the nursery, and the way those unresolved conflicts get reenacted in how the parent perceives the child and relates to the child. What child-parent psychotherapy brought, I think, to the field is a direct focus on what is happening to the child now, what is happening in the family context now, and how does that experience of adversity and trauma affect what is happening between the parent and the child now. So essentially, we are urging clinical attention not only to the psychodynamics of the parent as it is enacted in relation to the child, but also to what are the real life experiences of the child in current circumstances. And I think in that sense, I am really influenced in very lasting ways by Selma Freiberg, who was both a psychoanalyst and a social worker. Marquita Mays is a social worker. She will talk later about her work. I have tremendous respect for social work as the discipline that really upholds reality as a shaper of the psyche. And so child-parent psychotherapy really is an effort to integrate fantasy and reality, the past and the present, the child's impact on the parent as much as the parent's impact on the child, and kind of looking constantly at the mutuality of interactions that eventually coalesce in clinical moments that can become ports of entry for transformational intervention.
There have been a number of studies, haven't there, including 5 randomized control trials that have looked at whether child psychotherapy is helpful to families. What benefits has it shown?
Well, I'm very grateful to my colleagues at the Mount Hope Family Center, Sherry Todd and Jody Manley and Dante Cicchetti, who conducted 3 of the 5 randomized studies. So when you look at the number of measures, we find that there is an impact of child-parent psychotherapy relative to the control groups in cortisol regulation, telomere length. So at the biological level, there are changes that occur at the level of cognitive functioning in terms of IQ, at the level of quality of attachment, attachments being transformed from anxious attachments, disorganized attachments to secure attachments, quality of the parent-child relationship beyond attachment, for example, in partnering around conflict resolution and partnerships about shared goals, less aggression, less internalization, and less PTSD. And one of the things that is really very rewarding to us is that it's a 2-generation impact, in the sense that when we measure the mother's depression, overall psychiatric symptoms, and PTSD, mothers that have participated in child-parent psychotherapy have more adaptive mental health than mothers who participated in individual therapy.
And what do you think, Alicia, are the key ingredients to the success of this therapy?
I think that what child-parent psychotherapy has prioritized is what we call speaking the unspeakable. And this is something that gave us a lot of trouble at the beginning when we started with the model 25 years ago. And we were told that speaking up front about trauma is itself traumatizing, and that it is jarring and it's intrusive. And I want to thank here my dear colleague, the late Patricia Van Horn, because she and I held hands around our table and supported each other in saying, let's try it. We had a meeting with a psychoanalyst who is a wonderful trauma person, who said to us, the children will never tell you about their traumatic experiences when they are in the presence of their parents. And I remember Patricia and I being shocked by that. And then we said to each other, well, this person knows about trauma, but we know about young children. So let's try it. And this idea that you can say to a child, after having met with a parent and having the parent's partnership with you, your mommy, your daddy told me that they fight a lot and they hit each other, or that your daddy hit your mommy and then he left. And now you can't sleep and you are so mad at your mommy and you miss your daddy and you hit the dog and you hit your brother. That being real, being authentic, calling it the way it is, with a 2-year-old, a 3-year-old, a 4-year-old, a 5-year-old, I believe can be incredibly relieving, because it says, you mean this can be talked about? I don't need to keep it hidden. I don't need to worry that there is something deeply wrong with me, that I made it happen. And I think that speaking the unspeakable, of from the beginning framing the intervention around what we call the clinical formulation triangle of child-parent psychotherapy, which is, this happened to you. And it makes so much sense that now these are the ways that that fear, that anger are manifested. And this is a place to think together about what helps and how to help. And we do that with a parent triangle in visits with the parents during the foundational phase, where we create a partnership with the parent, and then we do it with the child in the presence of the parent. I think that is the secret sauce of child-parent psychotherapy. And what we see is that avoidance in PTSD measures, the first thing that goes down is avoidance. And parents stop avoiding, and then the child then is given permission to explore his or her own psyche. And that, I think, is what's transformational.
So let's track back a bit, Alicia, if you don't mind, and to chart the lineage of your work and your thinking. You were born in Paraguay and then went to live in Israel before emigrating to the United States. And at Johns Hopkins University, you studied for your PhD with Mary Ainsworth, known for her groundbreaking research in attachment theory. That must have had really quite a significant impact on you.
All of it had a significant impact on me. Living in Paraguay, I'm still Paraguayan. And I'm a Jewish Paraguayan or a Paraguayan Jew, depending on when and how, which of the identities is uppermost, depending on context at any particular time. But, the Jewish historical trauma is very present with me. And the Paraguayan historical trauma is very present with me. Paraguay lost 2/3 of its population in a war against Argentina, Brazil, and Uruguay in the mid-1800s. And that is something that you learn when you are in primary school. It has stamped the country. And so I come from two cultures where genocide and the destruction of society are realities. And I think that is perhaps why reality is so important to me. And we, of course, live here at a time when we are constantly witnessing or experiencing traumatic events, racism, genocide. So those have been very important. And I remember with Mary Ainsworth having this real discovery of how parental experiences affect children. That transmission, which happened in a more middle class, safe environment, but then really I could see the rawness of it when I went to study with Selma Freiberg, and we saw families facing a lot of adversity and living in tremendous poverty. So thank you for giving the context for the influences in my work.
You mentioned Selma Freiberg. She is one of the founders of the field of infant mental health, and she invited you to join her, didn't she?
Yes, I was very fortunate that, by family circumstances, I did my postdoctoral work with Selma Freiberg and then went to Baltimore, again for family reasons, and worked with Stan Greenspan at NIMH for a while. And from Stan, what I learned was observing the baby in terms of the constitutional characteristics of the baby, the temperamental characteristics of the baby, the individuality of the baby. Selma and Mary were much more interested in the impact of the parent on the child. And Stan was very interested on what was the individuality of the child. And so it's almost as if he helped me observe babies, not only from the point of view of their interactions, but from the point of view of their personhood. And then Selma, when she moved from Ann Arbor to California, she invited me to join her. And it was a wonderful experience to be able to be with her during the last years of her life.
Selma Freiberg coined very famously the metaphor ghosts in the nursery, didn't she?
Yes, that's right.
So perhaps it's worth us talking a little bit about that and the impact of her thinking around this. And for those of us who don't know what ghosts in the nursery are, perhaps you could explain it as someone who worked with her, exactly what she meant by that.
I'll be happy to. And you know, it's such a good question, Jane. I remember a neonatologist many years ago coming up to me and saying, "Do ghosts really exist?" It was so sweet. And I didn't quite understand, you know, I was young, I was awed by this person who was very famous. And I didn't quite know, do you mean concretely? Do you mean metaphorically? How exactly are you asking this question? So this is a perfect time to think about it. What Selma meant, and you know, I think that Bolas, when he talks about the shadow of the object, is talking about something very similar. It's the stamp that early experiences leave on us. And for Selma, the stamp was in the form of undigested conflicts that she did not put it this way, but I like to put it this way, exist in the context of what Freud called the four foundational anxieties of early childhood, which are the fear of being left, fear of separation, the fear of being unlovable, of losing love, the fear of body damage, what he calls castration anxiety, but we know that it transcends castration. That was a very specific, narrow focus that he had. But body damage takes every part of the body. Cutting our hair when we're 2 years old, or our nails, or having our nose cleaned. And then the last anxiety to emerge, what Freud called the fear of superego condemnation. And I like to call the fear of being bad, of having something intrinsically wrong with us. And I think that goes in the nursery are experiences with our loved ones that make us feel that we are going to be left if we don't live up to what our parents or our loved ones want us to be. The fear that we are deeply unlovable, the fear that we're going to be hurt, the fear that there's something deeply wrong with us. And I think that those interactions that make us feel that way are like structures around which our sense of self and our sense of relationships are formed, and they get transmitted, so that's how we perceived our intimate partners, our children, and in particular babies who are like a projective screen, what Selma called a transference object, on whom we project those unresolved experiences. And those are the ghosts. So the ghosts are experiences that are reenacted in the present with the baby of painful emotional moments in the past that shaped our sense of self.
So, Alicia, in 1985, your seminal paper, Angels in the Nursery, the intergenerational transmission of benevolent parental influences, was published. Tell us about the angels and why you say they're so important.
I want to start by thanking Bill Harris, who is the person who coined the term Angels in the Nursery. And he gave it as a gift to us. I still remember the phone call at 9 o'clock in the morning. I'm glad I answered, where he said, I was watching my son playing with his son. And it was so delightful. And I remembered how my wife played with my son. And then I remembered how my wife talked about what a wonderful mother she had. And I thought, oh, this is going from grandma to mom, from mom to father, father to child. How come nobody talks about angels in the nursery? And I remember that moment, my stomach just made a little jump of joy. It just felt so real. And I said, that is gorgeous, Bill. And I told him what happened inside me. And he said, oh, that's great. I was just checking with you because my children sometimes tell me that it's a nice idea. But, you know, you don't need to go too far with it. And during the rest of the day, I kept telling everybody, I told Patricia, I told everybody I encountered, I told about that dialogue. And everybody responded the same way. And the next day, Bill called and said, what about if we write a paper about it? And that's how the paper started. So I'm deeply grateful to him because from that moment of everyday magic, something was created that I think really has helped us in child-parent psychotherapy and the field to remember that just as traumatic experiences are transmitted, so are experiences of being loved, being protected, being cherished, being delighted in. And those are the ones that give us the roadmap for transcending despair.
So, as part of child-parent psychotherapy, this is really important, isn't it? To draw on those good memories that parents have got of the good moments in their childhood, even if there has been a real mix of both good and bad.
Yes, I think that one of the things we like to say is that we need to endeavor to end every session in a note of hope, or to imbue even moments of deep sorrow with a note of light, life as a chiaroscuro, as a combination of light and shadow, and not to do it in an artificial way, not to be Pollyannish, but to really look for a moment of authenticity in holding on to something that gives hope. I remember Thich Nhat Hanh said, I lost my smile, but the dandelion has it.
Say that again.
I lost my smile, but the dandelion has it. And I think that there are times when I am very sad, for example, or that I look at other people who are happy in a playground or walking and looking at the trees, etc. I think that reminding ourselves that we're part of the universe and of the wonder of the universe and our place in it, all those spiritual practices and emotional experiences and so on, I think they all come together in clinical moments. And I think we need to open ourselves to them and help the families we work with open themselves to them.
So before I hand over to Salam, I just want to ask you about toddlers.
Yes.
I think a lot of people are joining us today because they love toddlers too. Even though this is quite a neglected area, I think you've developed this incredible capacity to convey their inner world. And many colleagues say that this is one of your most important contributions, that actually you've given a voice to toddlers.
I love toddlers. And I think that it might have to do with the fact that there are parts of me that have remained stuck in toddlerhood. And, sometimes I wish I had more of a reflective function before I have a tantrum to stop it before it happens. This is something that Arietta and I talk a lot about. She hears my confessions. But I think that there is something about toddlerhood that is really quintessential about the rest of human life, is that struggle to belong and to be yourself, this longing to be unconditionally loved, and the despair that to be loved, you have to abide by certain expectations. And the despair of not having what you want, and then the great relief of repair after everything seems to collapse. I have a 2.5-year-old grandson right now who has a very intense temperament, and it is just glorious to watch him really show us how angry he is. And then when there is repair, have this beaming smile and go back to this wonderful engagement. And that is what I think about when I think of ghosts and angels, and that constant interplay between the light and the shadow. And I think toddlers live it moment to moment to moment, and they are our great teachers in the fact that, as one wonderful clinician said, do not take his first no as his last answer.
I find that really moving, Alicia, when you talk about toddlers. I think my inner toddler is responding to you and being heard. I'm going to hand over to Salam now, who's got some more questions for you.
Thank you, Jane.
Thank you, Alicia.
Yeah. I've been kind of trying to figure out readjusting myself as the conversation has gone on. And I guess I want to think back about this toddler example that you just provided, and thinking about the experience your grandson has in being, I imagine, having a kind of good enough environment where he more often than not, he's being responded to and in a way that feels affirming of who he is and his needs. And can you speak a little bit about what happens when that isn't the typical environment where a toddler is growing?
I think we see the beginning of rigid defenses. And that is something that Selma was brilliant about in helping us really observe children's behavior, children's responses, and understand them often through the lens of how is this a defense against unbearable feeling. She talked about avoidance happening as early as 2 or 3 months of age, where a baby was scanning the environment and he went through the mother's face as if she wasn't there, but smiled at the clinician. And this was a mom that was very removed from the child, and her emotional removal was interspersed by attacks of rage where she shook the baby. And the baby had to engage, even at that young age, in a sense of, I better not register you, because that would trigger disorganization, and my disorganization will trigger your rage. And those defenses become more and more entrenched as the patterns get reinforced. And we see children engage in identification with the aggressor, identification with the victim, compartmentalization of affect, converting passive into active by doing to weaker beings what the abuse that the parents or others do to them. All the defenses that we see later in life really have their root in the first 2 years of life.
And as you're talking about defenses, I'm thinking a lot about how we work with families, and how do we bring to awareness some of these challenges. And so as someone that trains clinicians in child-parent psychotherapy, what thoughts do you have about how to help us as clinicians make sense of what we're seeing, and then how do we translate that to the work with the families?
I think supervision is a sacred space where the supervisor and the supervisee meet in a very intimate manner, and where the supervisee's perception of what is happening clinically needs to be given space. So that we are witness to the clinician family, clinician child experience. And then I think the supervisor also needs to have a sense of conviction about what she knows or he knows, and her responsibility to convey it, so that there is a constant dance in supervision between honoring the emotional experience of the clinician and the clinician's perception of the family, but also teaching concepts that are foundational to clinical understanding, like the role of the unconscious, the repetition of the past and in the present, the role of defenses, the interplay of light and shadow. And for that, what we do, and it's very hard to do, and people don't like to do it. I did not like to do it when Selma asked me to do it, is we ask for narrative notes that describe what happened, what the child did, what the parent did, what we did in response, etc. And then we look for moments that represent something important in the emotional experience of the parent or of the child or of their interaction. And we point it out if the clinician was not aware of it. We ask them to stop there with us and to reflect on what happened. What do you think happened here? And then we join in expanding the lens that the clinician has to help her see it from deeper perspectives or broader perspectives than might have been the case in the moment.
I'm thinking that you have made some you still value psychodynamic theory. I hear you speaking about it all the time, but clearly there are some ways where your thinking has changed a little bit or evolved a little bit in terms of what you think matters most in terms of affecting change. Can you reflect a little bit on what are the things that you think are still very important from the psychodynamic tradition, and maybe what things you feel we can think about a little bit more?
You know, Selma Freiberg was brought to UCSF by Robert Wallerstein, who was the president of the International Psychoanalytic Association, I think the American Psychoanalytic Association, and his great contribution to psychoanalysis was to say that in the 1940s, that he thought we need a psychoanalytic understanding of reality. And I had the great honor of giving the Wallerstein lecture last April, not last April, but a year ago, I think. And I immersed myself in his articles in preparation for that. And I was so happy to see the extent to which he really spoke about reality. And in his book, 44 Lives in Treatment, he talked about how a transference-based psychoanalysis did not necessarily do much better than a supportive, emotional supportive psychoanalysis. And I'm a great believer in transference, but I remembered Selma teaching me that if the transference is benign and is not rigidly idealized, leave it alone and let it be the wind behind your sails that propels the treatment forward. The transference that you focus on is the negative transference to the baby. And when the negative transference to you becomes a danger to treatment, then you touch on it. But focus on the baby rather than yourself. I thought that was just a beautiful application, creative application of a classic concept, the classic concept of transference, but taking it and diverting it from the clinician as the most important person in the clinical constellation to the baby in relation to the parent and the parent in relation to the baby. So those are adaptations, I think, that maintain fidelity to the core values of psychoanalysis. The other thing that I think is absolutely extraordinarily important is to, again, in terms of reality, is the intergenerational transmission of racism, of oppression, of disempowerment, is the assumptions that we have about who the other is, and the place that we give the other in society in ways that we don't think twice about. And I think that the current movement, the anti-racist initiatives, are really expanding our lens in terms of assumptions that we make in institutions, in universities, in child welfare, in schools, in the streets, everywhere. In the medical system, we know now that Black babies have a higher likelihood of dying if they are treated by white doctors than if they are treated by Black doctors. That is a shocking finding, but it makes us have to look at the societal unconscious and the defenses that are now coming up full force in the form of fascist counterpoints that say, don't go there. I don't want to see it. We are superior. So I think that it's a very dynamic process, and psychoanalysis has a lot to offer, but also has a lot to learn from other points of view.
You mentioned, I've heard you say infant mental health as social justice.
Yes.
And I'm wondering, given what you just said, what are the ways that you were thinking about infant mental health being a vehicle for social justice?
We're very fortunate in the child trauma research program, my program, that we have members of our team who are at the forefront of understanding racism, understanding oppression, understanding historical trauma, and its transmission in the here and now, in institutions, in power relations, even within the program, and calling it out. And I think that openness to what is it that we can incorporate. I think that, this is such an important topic. I just want to bring everybody's attention to a document that was created by people working within the aegis of the Irving Harris Foundation, called the Tenets of Infant Mental Health, where there is that statement that infant mental health is social justice work, social justice, equity work, is really specifically exemplified in tenets that we are expected to reflect on. So I'd like to say that is a worthwhile looking into. But it's interesting that in the clinical situation, the internalization of oppression, the identification with the aggressor in terms of, for example, a mother feeling that her baby is too dark, which is one example, Salam, that is in our book, Make Room for a Baby. Thank you. And where the clinician's ability to stay with the mother and ask the mother, what does she feel when she sees her baby? And when she looks at the color of her baby's skin, what memories come to mind? What feelings come to mind? And she remembers being made fun of in her country of origin for the color of her skin. And people that looked like her being expected to be in the lower rungs of society. And then connecting that early pain with the defense against that pain and the wish to protect her baby from that experience that she had. And then the whole experience of her looking at her baby in this particular way of wishing that she were lighter acquires a different meaning. Because instead of taking it from a moralistic perspective or from a perspective of didactic teaching, this is how you are experiencing an internalized oppression that you are passing on to your baby. That is from the outside in. And it has to be from the inside out. It's what was it like for you? And then it makes sense. It makes sense emotionally, and the soul is freed from that oppression. It doesn't happen all at once. I remember my psychoanalyst once said, you think that because you have an insight, your life is going to change as soon as you leave the session. And I said, yes, I do think that. He said, no, it takes practice. You have to use the insight here and here and here and here. And oh, this is much harder than I thought. You mean you don't just have a magic wand, right? But that is a port of entry to that change.
Yeah. And it sounds like you're changing it slowly, little by little, at a micro level, but it could also have a macro level impact, right? When you're thinking about social justice and making change, and so helping this dyad, helping this mom change something about her perception of who she is, and gain insight about her early childhood and how it's currently getting played out between her and her infant, has far-reaching impact, right? Thank you. Well, I don't want to stop, but I'm going to have to hand it over to Jane, because this is probably the best part of today's event, is having the two of you, Arietta and Alicia, in conversation. So I'm going to hand it over, and I'll come back with Marquita in a little bit.
Thanks very much, Salam, and welcome to Arietta Slade, Alicia's guest speaker, with whom she's developed a very special relationship. Alicia is, Arietta, I should say, is Professor of Clinical Child Psychology at the Yale Child Study Center and an internationally recognized clinician and researcher. She's published widely on reflective parenting, the clinical implications of attachment theory, and the development of parental mentalization. One of her co-authors, Jeremy Holmes, has also joined us today. He also spoke at Grey Music's live legacy interview. So we're very happy to have you here with us, Jeremy. Arietta, you've collaborated with Alicia for over 40 years. How would you describe the legacy of Alicia's work?
Well, thank you, first of all, Jane and Salam, for this opportunity, and wonderful to see you, Alicia.
Great to be together, Arietta, and thank you for your wonderful visit with Sam to our house.
Oh, thank you for our wonderful day. We had a long trip to California, and seeing Alicia and her husband was absolutely the high point of it. So thank you. Well, I guess the story begins a little bit before I met Alicia, which is when I first read Selma Freiberg's paper on the ghosts in the nursery. And getting that book, which came out in 1980, and recognizing Alicia's name and amongst the contributors to the first book that Selma wrote, and sort of putting that somewhere in there. I come from an analytically oriented psychology background. And well, let me just fast forward a little bit. So I knew Alicia's name, and then I think we were both at one of the early 0 to 3 meetings, which was in 1981. And we were both there, and Alicia was there with her baby boy, who's now the father of her grandsons. And I remember we were just introduced and we met and we sort of hit it off. I mean, we both came from different backgrounds, but we both, had this really shared set of interests. I'd been already by that point very influenced by Mary Ainsworth. And I don't know how aware I was at that time that you'd worked with her, but I certainly was aware that you were very much working in that area. And as I've thought about it in preparation for this, I then sort of followed, well, first of all, we hit it off, but then I followed the arc of the work. And, your work was first in infant parent psychotherapy and sort of expanding that work. And you wrote a number of really classic papers that I used for teaching. You wrote with Julie Paul and with Charlie Zena, and you began to really expand the way we understood and thought about infant parent psychotherapy and to develop some, sort of clear approaches and so on. And then in 1991, you wrote one of the first randomized control trials of infant parent psychotherapy. Now, we all, as Alicia has just spoken so beautifully and brilliantly for the last hour about her thoughts and understanding, don't forget that this is a serious researcher. And you might say, oh, no, but you are. And you agree that paper.
We have a great team.
Well, but you assemble the team, and that is an art in and of itself. And that paper was one of the first times that you have to remember that in the years that Alicia and I grew up professionally, there was tremendous resistance to the idea that you could actually research what went on in therapy, that you could actually research clinical process, and that you could actually document shifts that would be meaningful, so that would demonstrate that therapy actually made a difference. And this study that Alicia did on this really new paradigm, which was infant parent psychotherapy, proving that it worked, was an enormous contribution. And I think that if you think about sort of the history of the field of infant mental health, this was one of those formative moments when the work that people were starting to recognize now was in a certain sense legitimized and has led to its being, really seriously considered from even that point on an evidence-based treatment, right? Which today is our, the god of evidence-based treatment, but we won't go down that road. And the next thing that happened is that in 1994, Alicia published the most wonderful book called The Emotional Life of the Toddler, which has been my go-to gift for parents for the last, I think we're talking almost 30 years now, which you've revised, but it's you talked, Jane, earlier about Alicia's passion for toddlers. Well, it really comes through in this book. And I remember giving it, I always assigned it to my undergraduate classes. And I had a young woman in my class who'd been a teenage mom and was raising her then 2-year-old and trying to go to college and so on. And I assigned the book and she came back and she said, this is amazing. This is so helpful. I'm so grateful to you. And I think I wrote to Alicia and told you this at the time. And then she later went on to be a social worker, which I thought was such a kind of wonderful testament to how she used what she was learning. And much of it, I really believe, was communicated in that book, and used it to, expand her own life and do the things that she really, really wanted to do. And then in the next, I want to say 5 to 10 years, I know there were all kinds of ways that this happened within your professional life, but you started seeing older children, and you started seeing older children who had been traumatized. And they started calling you in to consult on these cases where older children had been witness to trauma. And suddenly, and I think about Selma, beginning to work in a concrete way with traumatized families. But it was really that shift when you began working with families who were brought to you because of the trauma and who were brought to you because they were acutely suffering. And you were asked, what do we do for these? Not 1-year-old, not 2-year-olds, but 4 and 5-year-olds. And that was the time when you began developing child-parent psychotherapy. Mm-hmm. And it was such, it was as if, and I know, it was as if you went, older kids, we can expand this. We can help more kids. We can really understand how these phenomena affect kids in a much broader way. And of course, child-parent psychotherapy is not only used for children 5 and under, but it's, many people use the paradigm now to work with children who are even somewhat older. But that sort of focus on trauma, focus on a treatment approach that was kind of coherent and organized, really, again, took place in the late 90s to the point where you wrote the first manual for child-parent psychotherapy in 2005, which was Don't Hit My Mommy. And then in 2008, you and Patricia wrote really the classic book about parent-child psychotherapy. Then at that same time, Alicia wrote this paper called Angels in the Nursery, which she talked about earlier. And the focus on positive experience and positive aspects is a critical part of treatment and of life and of healing. And I read the paper and I sent it to a patient of mine who had really horrific, traumatic childhood, but it had these times with her aunt in the country every summer that softened that. And I sent it to her. I said, "You must read this. This, your aunt was your angel." And we've always used that as a touchstone. And I think I wrote to you at the time and said, I just sent this to a patient. And, the rest of you are probably familiar with the 17 years since then, which is the child-parent psychotherapy having become a worldwide phenomenon. And for all the ways that you spoke about it today, I think everyone can understand why it's been so powerful. And I think what I said to you, Jane, when you were asking me what it was about Alicia, I said, well, it's Alicia. It's who she is. We talk about it's who you are that matters. And the way Alicia has spoken today, I think conveys so powerfully, your depth, your passion, your compassion, your intelligence, your intuition, your warmth, just all of these qualities. Yes, you take all this brilliant knowledge, but you bring it together in such a remarkable way that you are a healing person, And I'm just grateful to know you.
Alicia's giving you a virtual hug.
Got it. She's pinned on my screen. She's pretty much all that I see. Speaking to her.
And how do you think Alicia's thinking has inspired your work, Arietta? How do you work differently because of Alicia? I know it could be quite hard to unpick where Alicia's influence starts and ends, but can you think there's some main aspects of your thinking that has been shifted by Alicia?
I think, I wrote down a lot of the things she said today, but, I too love toddlers. I did my dissertation on toddlers. Her book just enriched my sense of toddlers and made me, say, yeah, that we've written papers together actually about toddlers. Right. And I think the Angels in the Nursery work really affected me, but I think it was Alicia's drumbeat about trauma that really had such an impact. I can remember in the doctoral program in which I was a senior faculty member for many years, we worked in an inner city clinic. I kept saying, trauma. We have to talk about trauma. And this was a clinic where this, at this time, was simply not in people's vocabulary. It was the patients got very good dynamic psychotherapy by the trainees, but there was this absence of an appreciation of trauma. And I think it was really, and I know in our work in Minding the Baby, I would always be going trauma. And just how do we think about it? How do we work with it? How do we take it seriously? And I have heard as recently as like last week, you can't bring trauma up because it'll traumatize the parent or the person. And you're like, you think they don't know this happened to them? This is not a secret. It releases them from the shame. And I think Alicia's boldness in insisting on this and her persistence. And I remember, I think I read it in the paper about meeting up with a young woman that you had worked with as a young child and sitting with this now young adult and saying, could I have done more? Could I have helped her and understand her trauma better? Could I have done more healing with her? And just this relentless curiosity about what can we gain? What can we learn? How can we push this? I want to keep understanding. I want to keep pushing it. That has just defined your whole trajectory as a professional, but I think also as a human being.
Yeah, and I'm wondering, Arietta, how important it has been for you to have Alicia to share your thinking with in terms of clinical work.
Well, about 6 months ago, she sent me a transcript for a case, a meeting. And I remember thinking, and I looked at it, she said, what do you think? And I responded, and then we had a whole conversation. She said, I just wanted to know how you thought about it, and it's those kind of exchanges that we have that are really meaningful and valuable to me.
And I want to say the reason that I sent that transcript to Arietta is because it was an example of a child playing out a traumatic situation, but in a way that was so interspersed with the child's fantasy life that I needed Arietta's mind you saw how integrative she is, to help me understand the interplay of symbolism and raw reality in a way that widened my lens of how I was looking at it. And I think that is one of the biggest challenges in trauma work, because what trauma does is very often is crash through the brain's capacity to think logically, to symbolize, to reflect. And it reminds me of what Daniel Kahneman wrote about thinking fast and slow, where trauma stamps your brain right in the amygdala and makes you learn something indelibly. This is dangerous. And then there are all these reminders, traumatic triggers, traumatic reminders. And the learning to identify the traumatic triggers so that you think, this is a reminder, but it's not the real trauma. When my husband raises his voice, it is not my father about to yell at me, about to hit me. It is not my mother and father about to throw things at each other. It is my husband getting irritated with me because for the 17th time I asked him to pick up his socks and he didn't, or something along those lines. And that is the thinking slow, is the applying of the insight again and again and again. And what Arietta does for me is take a look at a script and help me wade through what we might consider as the raw enactment of a traumatic moment and what we might consider as the symbolic elaboration of it in the context of the child's total experience, cognitive development, and so on. Does that make sense, Arietta?
Yes. I never thought about it in terms of thinking fast and thinking slow, but that's a really helpful metaphor. That's really helpful.
That sort of reminds me of a conversation that we were having before we came on air about supervision. In a way, what you're doing for each other is almost like peer supervision, discussing cases and illuminating areas that perhaps one of you hasn't quite clearly seen. But you were talking both together about the importance and value of supervision, and in particular about the child psychotherapy training that you're you're seeing that's going on. I think you're talking about the US, but maybe you've got other international comparisons. So I'm just interested in where you see the value of supervision, both of you, and how that can really improve how clinicians work with children and families. Do you want to go?
What do you think?
You're asking me?
Right.
That was close. Well, we've talked about this a lot, and actually, I think you mentioned it earlier in response to one of Salam's questions. And you said that you think that supervision has two roles. And you said, and I would broaden this to say training in general, because I don't just think it's supervision, but you said the dance between honoring the emotional experience of the clinician or of the parent or of the child, and also teaching foundational concepts to the clinician. And those foundational concepts include an understanding of dynamics, of defenses, of the unconscious, of what relationship, the sort of dimensions of relationships and how they can falter. And, which is what you said earlier. You said something about what happens when there's trouble in the toddler period is it initiates primitive defenses. And primitive defenses is what we are generally up against. And oftentimes, I think we don't understand, or the people don't fully understand that these are defenses. These are defenses against, as you would say, unspeakable pain, unbearable reality. And therefore, the defenses are what we resort to. And I think so that's one of the foundational pieces of knowledge. And the other foundational piece of knowledge, which you also mentioned, are the realities of child development. When children are expected to do what, when they are able, and that's stuff that, in both years in my training was kind of part of our DNA.
Yes.
Part of our DNA. And I feel that it's less, and also an understanding of mental health difficulties, in children and in adults. Those were part of our DNA. And I think with your focus of on trauma, you've brought the mental health piece in a way front and center back in. But I just think that we're less concerned with communicating these foundational knowledges, if you will, and foundational languages than we used to be.
Did you want to add anything, Alicia, before we move?
Yes, I think that, there is so much emphasis lately about the clinician's experience, the clinician's emotional experience in the clinical moment, that supervisors, I think, often feel shy about imparting knowledge. And I would like to restore. Also, we're moving, I think, towards a time. It's really interesting in terms of point counterpoint. It's like we're having half the world becoming fascist and half the world advocating for a less hierarchical structure of politics and relationships and so on. And the two models are ducking it out. And who knows what is going to happen. We're in a very dangerous time, I think. But I think that we also find it everywhere in the family relations, for example, where parents are sometimes afraid of becoming the disciplinarians of their children, of deciding what is okay to do and what is not okay to do. And I think teachers and professors and supervisors are often also asking themselves, do I have the right to teach? And what is a dominant form of knowledge versus a supremacist form of knowledge? And so we are in a period of great reckoning with assumptions. And sometimes, as we reckon with assumptions, we let go of a sense of authentic direction that we can offer without imposing. We can offer as a possibility to think together in the supervisory experience, but where we give ourselves permission to know what we've learned and to offer it and share it, and then to have a counterpoint if needed be. I think one of the wonderful things that I'm experiencing with some of our pre-docs and post-docs is that I might come with a subjective interpretation of what the parent and child are going through from the perspective of the parent and the child. And the supervisee gives me a societal interpretation from the perspective of internalized racism, for example. And then we sit together with this, wow, there is this and there is this. Do they fit together? How do they integrate? Does one have greater clinical relevance in the here and now, and the other one have more societal relevance, or not? But I think it enriches the quality of the relationship, the supervisory relationship. And I think it goes back to what Salam and I were talking about, of what does psychoanalysis have to learn from the current moment.
Well, thanks for now, Alicia. I'm going to be handing back to Salam to continue asking you some questions.
And so now it's time to welcome Alicia's second special guest, Marquita Mays. Marquita is a clinician and national trainer in child-parent psychotherapy and expert on race and trauma experienced by African-American families and communities. Marquita, you're a co-director of perinatal mental health at the Child Trauma Research Program at the University of California, San Francisco, and you're co-director of Embrace, a perinatal care program for Black families. Maybe we should start by you telling us a little bit more about the program.
Totally. Hi, everyone, whatever time zone that you all are in. Yes, I'm happy to share about Embrace. I think I always start off with Embrace is an intervention of love. It is a labor of love. It is a model of care that was developed by myself and an OBGYN and a midwife at UCSF in response to Black maternal and infant birthing outcomes in the United States. We have learned a lot through our families that we have provided services to about what is actually needed to successfully get Black birthing people and babies across the line of labor and delivery and through the first year of life. So the components of our program is offering race concordant, race conscious perinatal care that includes prenatal care in a group format or individual format. We also offer perinatal mental health services. And we learned very early on from our families that instead of offering it after a problem had been identified with the patient, symptomology was elevated or at a peak, was to offer it at intake and actually normalize mental and emotional wellness along with your medical health during the perinatal period of your life. So we quickly averted how we bring in families and offer mental health services from the very beginning. In addition, we learned pretty quickly from our families. We came in with this idea that we were going to provide group centering pregnancy for our families. And then they came in with all of the things. It was like, nope, you need to pay attention to this. You need to pay attention to that. We have an open door policy with our families that anyone from your village who is along the ride with you during your perinatal journey is incorporated into your care. So that includes fathers, that includes godmothers, that includes grandmothers, that includes aunties. It includes whoever you need to be there with you. We also learned from our family that prenatal care is just one component of helping families get across the line of a safe labor and delivery. The other component that we learned with our families is like the actual time of labor and delivery is where it gets really dangerous. And we learned to become a buffer systemically for our families. There are lots of messaging out there. There's lots of reports out there around how providers implement bias and systemic racism and do not listen to Black mothers when they are saying that they're in pain, or when they are speaking an internal intuitive wisdom about their bodies and not being paid attention to. And so we had to, develop a system where once our families are admitted into labor and delivery, how are we still present as a provider team in providing safe passage for that family? And I think probably the last component of our program that we thought we were going to be done after the babies were here. And foolishly, that is not the case, as you all know. We stick with our families through the first year of life for the child. So we really get to spend a good chunk of time with our families, really supporting, elevating Black excellence, Black leadership all the way through.
Well, congratulations on this phenomenal work, Marquita. And I understand that Vice President Kamala Harris visited your program recently and named it an exemplary model of Black maternal care. So congratulations on that recognition as well. I know you did a fellowship with Alicia's team, and then you decided to stay on with them. What influence did Alicia have on your development as a clinician and kind of where you're at today and the choices you're making today?
Yeah, so it was a love fest between Alicia and I during my training year. I would say that our relationship, I think, is a lot more holistic now, where we have gone through our honeymoon phase. We've had some highs, we've had some lows with each other. The greatest influence that Alicia has had on me as a clinician is giving me full permission to be my full self in my professional environment, and not having to wear a mask, not having to, silence myself, being able to speak up however it comes out, the way that it comes out, and not having to worry about, someone in a position of power and authority being punitive towards me and or labeling me or stereotyping me as an angry, mad Black woman if I was exhibiting, righteous rage in a moment of injustice, however it might have played out systematically or at a societal level. So that's been the biggest influence that Alicia has had on me, and the reason why I chose to stay at CTRP. I went there after graduating with my master's in social work to get training in this thing called trauma, because my practicums introduced me to little kids who I had no idea what it was that they were contending with, and was introduced to her program to get a deeper training in it. And what struck me about child-parent psychotherapy was how flexible of a model it is, how it is a model that you truly get to meet families where they are and work with them and co-create with them what they want their treatment to look like, what they want their healing to look like. It didn't feel rigid to me, and I felt like it was something that I could adapt to the community that I am committed to and that keeps me in the field, which is the Black community, African American community.
Thanks, Marquita. And you really highlight the importance of finding a home for oneself, right? A place that feels true and authentic to who one is. Alicia has described her supervision with Selma as creating angels for her, kind of a secure base. I've had some experiences like that in supervision myself, and I also sometimes get a small taste of that when I'm interacting with Alicia. Could you share what it's like to be supervised by Alicia?
Yes, there are two moments that pop up in my head immediately. One, I remember one of my very first supervisions with Alicia. It was a family, really complex case. And she sat across the table from me and she said, "I'm channeling you right now." And I was like, "What? What's happening? What's going on?" I don't know if I signed up for this. But it was at that moment where she taught me, by being in relationship with me, to go deeper, to go to the depths of not only what I was feeling, but also what the family was bringing to our treatment, and to see them beyond sort of the boxes that they check. And then the other moment that I can think of being in a supervisory relationship with Alicia is when I showed up to supervision one day, super cranky and irritable and like attitude on 1000. And instead of making me sit through 2 hours of group supervision, she told me to go home and take a nap. And that was probably the best thing that could have ever happened, was me going home and getting rest and taking care of myself. And the work with that family continued in a delightful way. But I just always remember that moment where it was clear, like, you need to prioritize taking care of yourself in order for you to sustain yourself in doing the work and taking care of families. And that is something that I do my best to also share and impart upon the team that I've built with Embrace, is prioritizing the care of self in order to sustain oneself in doing trauma work.
So you're starting to talk about kind of Alicia's legacy and what you're carrying with you yourself as a leader now. And I want to make opportunity for exchange between the two of you instead of speaking to each of you. So I want to kind of step back, but I wondered if you wanted to talk with Alicia about that. Any legacy that you carried with you.
You know, it has been an honor, Alicia, to grow up at CTRP and to pay attention to what kind of leader I wanted to be based off of the kind of leader that you are, which I would say that you are a bold leader. You are audacious. You have courage. You have tenacity. And I am someone who was given permission by the family that raised me to always raise hell. And it's been nice to see you raise hell as a leader when it's necessary and when it's needed. Thank you for like removing barriers out of my way, for lifting ceilings every time I would hit my head in systems so that Embrace could be a thing. And it's also been nice to watch you as a leader show your vulnerable side. The rest of the world sees Alicia on this pedestal, but she does a really good job, I think, with our team of letting us see the light and the shadow of being a great leader, being a leader who is brilliant, who is intelligent, but a leader who also has flaws and is human and is open to not always being perfect or not always being like the expert in the room and taking a back seat when there's another voice or when there's another perspective that needs to hold more power than her own, even though she is someone who is really powerful.
Marquita, thank you. Thank you so much, because I see you as really helping me grow in the area of racial justice in a way that I would not have without you. And I feel that, you know, your courage in calling me with my own blind spots or just areas of complete ignorance and doing it with a complete, I think that the love fest that we had in that first year gave us like the secure base to kind of really be real with each other in areas where I had deep convictions, you had deep convictions, and you said to me, your convictions are off. And then sending me materials that really got me to reflect on preconceptions that were based on fear. It was like, are my people endangered? And you were saying, it's not about your people right now. It's about my people right now. And I still remember those exchanges, which were often on email at night. Remember that? And
yes, indeed.
yes, indeed. And I think that I am so grateful for it. I think you really enriched me in a way that has made me a stronger person. So thank you.
I'm just wondering, Marquita, whether actually it's Alicia's capacity to have a difficult conversation that makes her a very useful person to talk with.
A difficult conversation, I think a complex conversation is what Alicia has a great depth of experience in. I think also an emotionally intelligent conversation because one can be brilliant in other areas, but if one doesn't have the ability to have insight about self and not utilize power in oppressive ways, then you can't engage in that type of dialogue. And Alicia exhibits that to the 10th power in our relationship.
I know we have to, unfortunately, again, stop for a moment because there's so many questions coming in on the chat, and we want to take a little bit of time to answer the questions. And we want to thank you, Arietta, and you, Marquita, for joining us as special guests to Alicia. Like you said, Marquita, depending on your time zone this morning, this evening, this night. So thank you for being with us.
Marquita, it's nice to meet you. It's nice to meet another person in Alicia's orbit. It's wonderful. So thank you for all that you've said. It's really beautiful. Thank you.
So
thank you all so much as well.
So we're getting some questions from our audience here today. We've got lots of people, I think, who want to be asking some questions. I'd like to start off with a question from Suzanne Zedike, who was our legacy interviewee last month. She says, I would love to hear any of today's speakers reflect more about why Western society has such difficulty thinking about infants and young children as experiencing trauma. She says, our society, of course, prefers to think about children's behaviour rather than experience. How do they make sense of this cultural resistance? Perhaps we can start with you first, Alicia.
You know, one of the, it's a superb question, but I do wonder whether it is this society or whether it is across societies. And I'm not pretending to know all societies, but I know from my experience with South America, for example, growing up in Paraguay and living in Argentina and visiting South American countries, where there was this assumption that babies do not remember, that young children do not notice, and that the less you talk about painful things with children, the better, because then you protect them from that. So in South America, which is a place that I know, and Central America, Latin America in general. I know that that is still very much the assumption that the first 5 years of life are, protected. And I know in Israel, which is the other country where I have really done very in-depth work. When I said, the first 5 years are really where trauma becomes indelible, that came as a surprise. So I just think that we have a tendency to want to protect babies as a species almost. And because I believe that it reminds us of our own pain, our own unspoken pain as young children. And it's an effort to compartmentalize, to avoid, to forget, that just gets transmitted. That's my understanding of it.
Yeah, thanks, Alicia. I remember somebody saying they went to a parliamentary meeting here in the House of Commons, and it was jam-packed full, and then somebody raised the issue of babies, and the whole place just cleared out in a matter of minutes. Marquita, I was wondering whether you had any thoughts on Suzanne Zedek's question about our resistance to think as a society to think about trauma.
I agree with what Alicia said, and I was also holding there are so many things that are out of parents' control, as far as sometimes it's as simple as, how do I keep a roof over my head? how do I meet my basic needs in life? And when you don't have the ability to control meeting your basic needs, you need to find these buffers. And I think, like what Alicia said is spot on. It's a buffer. I can't control the things that I need in order to survive. Then mentally, I kind of check out, and I do the same thing for my baby as well.
Salam, you have some questions, I think.
Yeah, I've been trying to track on the chat. They're going fairly quickly. There's been a couple of questions having to do with the long-term social and emotional impact on young children from the pandemic. And that's, I think, on a lot of people's minds. I wondered, perhaps Arietta and Alicia could take that one.
I'm reminded of somebody saying, we're all in the same storm, but we don't all have the same boat. Mm-hmm. And I think what Marquita just said speaks to that, right? I think that we have to look at what are the boats that families have, what kinds of boats, and who's steering the boat, and what do babies perceive as the sturdiness of the boat and the reliability of the captain. I think that there are children that are going to go through this unscathed, and even might even profit from the fact that parents are now more available. Those parents who have access to resources are at home more, are more, do not have 14 hours of work, etc. And there are children, particularly Black and brown children, that are poor, that don't have access to resources, where the combined adversities of socioeconomic stresses, racism, lack of access to good medical care, good education, good schools. There are 1 million children missing from the school system, from the public school system, at least. What will happen to those children? So I think that this is a real moment where the shameful disinvestment in public health, in public education, in public structures is really having an effect where, as Anda from the ACEs experience said, epidemiology and neuroscience combine, because the shameful lack of safety nets becomes embedded in the body. And those children who do not have access to resources through family resources are going to suffer the most. That's why I think infant mental health is social justice work, is advocating for policies that protect parents and protect children.
I agree with everything you both said. I guess the only thing I would add is that when you mentioned before that people don't like to think about babies, the group that has been, and again, taking into account all that you were describing in terms of differences in resource, different boats, parents of children under 5 have not been able to get their children vaccinated. In the US, now let's not even talk about the rest of the world where many people have not been vaccinated, but the stress that has placed within the United States on parents of children under 5, that they have been more isolated, there are fewer resources for their children, they're more worried about their children getting sick. And when you kind of read the popular press, and it's hardest to be a parent of an under 5. I mean, that's a very challenging period. But when you, it's like, it's been a full year and a half that we've waited, isn't it? A year and a half, if not a little more. We've waited for vaccines for under 5s, as if they were just an afterthought. And parents of children in this age have been begging for resources for vaccination for kids this age. So, and I know it varies tremendously around different countries, but I just want to say that at least within the US, the failure to develop a reasonable vaccine for kids, I think it's had a big impact.
I just wanted to talk to you, Alicia, about John Bowlby, who came to visit you where you were working. I think he came to visit Mary Ainsworth, didn't he? One of our legacy interviews has been with Juliet Hopkins, his niece, and that's on our website. A really brilliant insight into child mental health she has. But I was wondering what the impact of John Bowlby's visit had on you and on your thinking.
Angel in the nursery memory. There was something so kind about John Bowlby's presence. He was so calm, and he had such a sense of quiet openness. And I remember feeling absolutely stunned that he actually asked me, what was it like to code these thick notes that were transcripts of the home visits for Selma Freiberg's study of attachment? When you were looking at the face-to-face interaction between mother and baby at 3 months of age, what were the things that stood up for you? And it was like he's asking me, and he was such a wonderful listener. I think he was much more interested in listening than in speaking. But when he spoke, he just said something small and very meaningful that kept the conversation going. So it's more of a visceral sense that I have of his presence. Wonderful man.
I know he was very encouraging of your clinical work.
Yes.
Do you know what he appreciated about it?
I think he thought of himself as more intellectual, as more in his brain. And I think he kind of liked my going straight to feeling. And I think that's probably what, it was kind of like he felt that he wanted that sense of circumvent the intellectualized structure and go to what does it feel like in the body, in the space between us. And I think he was very capable of it, but I think that as a clinician, that's not where his passion was. His passion really was in creating theory. And he realized that in the clinical moment, you have to forget theory, except when it kind of says, this can be helpful now to think of ordinary maternal hate, for example.
Yeah. There's a simultaneous smile when you mentioned about the fact that John Bowlby liked you going to feelings. I think we all smiled and thought, yes, we like that too about you.
Alicia, there's been a lot of comments in the chat just with gratitude to you. I'll just read one of them that represents many others. Your wisdom, humility, kindness comes through and influences your work. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for your work. It's meant the world to me, and being in your presence nurtures my soul. I have to attend the meeting now, sadly, but will look forward to listening deeply to the recording. Mil gracias. And many, many other similar notes of gratitude. There's been also a lot of exchanges with links and resources and articles about some of the things we've been talking about. So I think it's been a very full meal that we've had together here.
There's a lovely there's a lovely comment here from Cheryl Hubert saying this has been one of the most regulating experiences I've had in the past few years. One of the most regulating experiences I've had in the past few years of living through this pandemic and working with young families. It reminded me how important it is to keep doing your own deep emotional work as we work with parents and children. It never really ends. What a privilege. Thank you, everyone. That's a really good note to end on, isn't it, Alicia?
Thank you so much for this opportunity. Thank you, Jane. Thank you, Salam. And thank you, Arieta and Marquita, for being in my life on a day in, day out basis. Love you.
Thank you, Alicia.
Thank you, everybody, for coming.
Thank you. And many thanks to, as Alicia said, to our special guests, Arieta Slade and Marquita Mays. If you've enjoyed hearing from Arieta, she'll be our live legacy interviewee with us next March 2023, on March the 7th. So please go to MINDinMIND, our website, if you'd like to book ahead. It's already up there, so if you'd like to see Arieta, you can get your tickets already. And many thanks to all of you who have joined us and contributed or just listened. It's been a pleasure to be in your company. And thank you to Andrew Hirsch for his support on tech today. And last but not least, I want to thank my colleague, Salam Solomon. It's been a pleasure to do this with you today. If you're on Facebook, Twitter and LinkedIn, please do say hello, connect with us. But for now, many thanks and bye-bye. See you soon.